Hi there, students. In furtherance to this lecture that we have started on comparative pollution laws, well, today I wish to discuss about the Canadian pollution laws and regulations. In the previous lecture, we have discussed, I believe, China, and now we have decided to. I have decided to pick Canada as a case study here because I came across this Canadian legislations and they have several regulations. In fact, they have very much gases and in field specific legislation to combat the pollution. So let's have a look at it. When it comes to the Canadian environmental legislation, in fact, they are pretty much proactive and you will find, and that's what I also discovered. If you remember in one of the previous classes when we discussed about environment impact assessment, and if you remember, it was United States which came up with this EIA law for the very first time way back in 1970s. And well, you will find that many of these legislation which Canada has, they are pretty much harmonized with the United States legislations. Canada came up with EI legislation 2 years after that. In 1973 only, Canada came up with the EI legislation. If I'm not wrong, maybe it was the second country to come up with the EI law. So even with respect to pollution laws, when I was referring to all of them, most of them are in very much proper harmony with they have been enacted in a such a way that it all harmonizes the American laws. So when it comes to the law of the land, the Constitution Act of 1867 of Canada, it clearly enshrines that its legislative authority, it's been divided. It's very much federal in nature. So they have a federal government, a federal legislature, and then they have the provincial legislature. Now, when it comes to challenges relating to environment, and especially with respect to pollution, it is related to climate change, right? And we all know that under the climate change regime, China, and of course when it comes to this side, Canada, not China in this case, of course, I mean the Canada played a very significant role. And Canada, in fact, they have adopted several such measures. They are also signatory to the Paris Agreement. They have in fact ratified the same in 2016. And the target that they have set in their NDC, so called the, if you remember, the nationally determined contribution, it was to reduce, economy-wide greenhouse gases emissions by 30% below 2005 levels, and by 2030, that's what the target that they have set. So that is the reason because of which they ratified and they adopted this pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change. Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. It is the federal government's plan primarily to meet the end of the Paris Agreement to meet its emission reduction target and grow the economy, which they have set out in their nationally determined contributions to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the central element of this particular framework is the commitment to of pricing the carbon pollution across the country by 2018, and in order to implement that, which the commitment that they have made under the Paris Agreement, the government have set out several actions which has outlined the pan Canadian framework, and it has been kind of supported by several federal investments which was announced in their budgetary allocation in 2017. And thereafter the Canada in fact went ahead and it also became party to climate and clean air coalition to reduce short-lived climate pollutants, which is of course a voluntary initiative basically aimed to produce the environmental public health and addressing the climate change. Now, when it comes to environmental law, the specific legislation that they have is the Canadian Environment Protection Act of 1999, CEPA in short. Now, CEPA, it is a well, just like our Environment Protection Act. This is their prime main major main or major federal legislation with respect to combating pollution and protecting the environment. So, in the very federal level, they have something called Environment Climate Change Canada, also known as ECCC, and Transport Canada. TC. So, Environment, Climate Change Canada and Transport Canada, they have the mandate to regulate the emissions with respect to all these engines, especially the internal combustion engines, which are responsible for pollution. And under the CEPA, so-called Central Canadian Environment Protection Act, the Environment Canada, they have the authority, the so-called the ECCC has the authority to regulate the emissions for all these on-road engines as well as for off-road engines also, most of the categories especially. In fact, the CEPA also transfers the legislative authority for regulating these emissions from on-road engine vehicles and engines to Environment Canada from Transport Canada's Motor Vehicle Safety Act. And when it comes to Transport Canada, it's on the other hand has the responsibility to regulate the emissions for aircrafts, for railways, for commercial marine vehicles. So ECCC, most of the on-roads and off-roads engine combustions regulations, and TC on the other hand looks into the aircraft, railways as well as the marine vehicle vessels. So the Canadian federal government, they have this clear fact. Now with respect to that, they also have issued the regulations to control the emissions of the air pollutants. It is known as the criteria air contaminants. Now, this criteria in air contaminants covers the nitrous oxides, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, several suspended particulate matters, and the greenhouse gases. So, generally, all these laws that they have adopted, you will find that they are pretty much they have harmonized their emission standards with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, this is what the similarity that you will find. The US, they have also this federal agenda on cleaner vehicles, engines, and fuels. Similarly, they have also adopted these ECCC and TC, and then the criteria air contaminants. Now, in addition to that, there is something called National Pollutant Release Inventory. Now, this National Pollutant Release Inventory, it basically tracks the pollution in Canada. It provides a very publicly accessible inventory of pollutants which are released in air, in water, in land, which can also be disposed, which are also transferred for recycling. So they prepared this inventory of pollutants, commonly known as the National Pollutant Release Inventory. Now, in addition to that, this National Pollutant Release Inventory, it also covers the information relating to the annual emissions from the site of the industrial facilities. They usually publish it, and it's the Environment Canada, the ECCC, which publishes it, and this is published under the CEPA, of course, which was adopted way back in 1999. So the National Pollutant Release Inventory also includes the emissions of air emission standards, air emissions estimates, sorry, whether it has been complied or not. All these things are pretty much mentioned in there. You will also find the other point sources like non-industrial sources like motor vehicles and all. That data is also there with NPRI, so called the National Pollutant Release Inventory. And this inventory also provides the information which are basically used to identify and monitor the sources of pollution in Canada. And thereafter they develop certain indicators for the quality of water, quality of land, quality of air, and they thereafter evaluate how much to be released, how much to be transferred, etc., etc. So this is a very combined information which they kind of it's a very well strategized mechanism that they have adopted in order to identify and take necessary actions from time to time, so that they can set out their priorities with respect to environment, and they can also implement the policy initiatives and by undergoing proper risk assessment measures. So this is something which there with respect to the National Pollutant Release Inventory. Now, in addition to that, when it comes to emission standards, there are several regulations that I came across. Now, with respect to the greenhouse gases emissions, GHG emissions or anthropogenic gases emissions, the federal government of Canada, they have set out two categories, in fact, and this is pretty much harmonized with the United States standards. For them, they have something called the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. So, in the same line, they also adopted the standards and regulations for greenhouse emissions, and they have categorized it. They have something for the light duty vehicles and they have something for heavy duty vehicles. Now, for light duty vehicles, they have this particular regulations known as passenger automobile and light truck greenhouse gas regulations. Once again, I repeat it: passenger automobile and light Truck Greenhouse Gas Regulations, SOR 2010-201. So this is from 2010. This regulation was basically issued in October 2010. And if you refer to that, the prime objective of this regulation is to reduce the GHGs from passenger automobiles, from light trucks. And in order to do that, this regulation also enable the authorities to establish certain emission standards and certain testing procedures, which are of course once again in proper alignment with the federal requirements that is there in United States. So you will find a lot of influence that is there in Canadian pollution laws, and this influences of course the United States legislations, federal legislations to be very specific. In fact, these regulations, they basically prescribe all these, annual emission standards from time to time for the new model of vehicles. Especially, there is one already in existence for all the vehicles which were manufactured from 2001 to 2016. So, the roles and responsibilities of the manufacturers and the importers are also there, that has been taken into consideration. So, the manufacturers and the importers, they have to also meet all these standards which has been clearly specified. These regulation in fact require the importers, the manufacturers to meet these fleet average greenhouse gas emissions as specified for particular vehicles from time to time, which runs on the emissions on methane and nitrous oxides, and which emits methane and nitrous oxides. So there is a specific standards for emissions of methane and nitrous oxides. So this is something which I have clearly mentioned. Now there were certain amendments which were also adopted subsequently. 2010 October it was issued, but in 2014 there were certain amendments which in fact established something called progressively more stringent annual fleet average GHG standards, and this was for period of 2017 to 2025 model years. So this amended regulation in fact included that whatever the cars which is going to be manufactured between 2017 to 2025, they are all required to achieve an average 5% annual reduction in GHG emissions. As for the light trucks are go, as for the light trucks goes, they have typically, which are used by farmers in Canada, even by the construction workers. They are also equally important as they have been specified, and this regulation in fact provides a very short-term relief in form of less aggressive annual reductions. So these light trucks will be required to achieve in an average of 3.5 annual GHG reductions for a model year of 2017 to 2021, and then again subsequently, so initially 5 years, it will be more like 4 years to be very specific, it will be 3.5% annual GHG emission reduction, but subsequently from 2025 to 2020, 2022 to 2025, it will be 5% reduction. So this in fact gives very much enough time to all those manufacturing companies to come up with certain technology, to find out a technological solution to reduce the emissions. So this is a push that they have generated, push for these manufacturers to consider, to think over, and to come up with something which is far more energy efficient and pretty much less emitting in nature. In addition to this light vehicles, you also have this heavy duty vehicle and engine greenhouse gas emission regulation, SOR 2013-24. This came in the year 2013, and it kind of sets out very performance based greenhouse gas emission standards for on-road heavy duty vehicles like tractors, heavy tractors, highway tractors, buses, dump trucks, etc., which are made in 2014 and subsequently. So this is applicable for those vehicles. Now these standards and procedures are once again in alignment with the federal regulations of United States. So this is basically for on-road heavy-duty vehicles, and please do refer to that. Here, what they have done is they have decided to apply this new regulation for model year 2018 to 2027. So for light-duty vehicle, it was, if you remember, it was till 2025. Right, and from 2017 to 2025, but for heavy duty vehicles they have kept the model year as 2018 to 2027. When it comes to smoke related emission regulations, there is something called on-road vehicle and engine emissions regulation, which was promulgated under the Canadian Environment Protection Act of 1999 only. This basically sets out several smog related air pollutant emission standards for passenger cars, light duty trucks, motorcycles, heavy duty vehicles, etc., which are of course these engines which were started manufacturing in 2004 model year. So 2004 model year are regulated by this particular on-road vehicle and engine regulations, engine emission regulations, and this regulation is, once again, it is pretty much in compliance with the 2004 EPA standards of United States, where they have this phase one, phase two. Phase one was US 2004, phase two was 2007 for heavy duty vehicles, and phase one was also for the medium and the light duty. So this is pretty much, the Canadian legislations are pretty much in, they draw all their inspiration from the United States and they harmonize it accordingly. There were certain subsequent amendments which came in this particular regulation in 2015 with respect to the on-road vehicle and engine emission regulations. They harmonized the Canadian requirements with the United States EPA Tier 3 emission regulation, or Tier 3 emission regulation, which starting from the model year they fixed this time as 2017. So there were certain key regulations which kind of they have generated. So they brought very tighter Tier 3 emission standards. They decided to phase in with all these 2017 model year vehicles, and they want to implement them fully by 2025. And the standard that they have decided is like they have standard at up to 80% and 70% for more volatile, organic compounds, nitrogen oxide, etc., particulate matter, etc., and more stringent evaporative emission standards also at the same point of time. They have also insisted a system of generating, banking, and trading emission credits, also with the possibility of early credit, which will start from 2015, which started from 2015 model year itself. So these are some of the factors which they have taken into consideration with respect to their on-road vehicle and engine emission regulations. Now, in addition to that, there are also certain sets of gas-specific, certain GHG-specific regulations, like they have gasoline regulations, sulfur in diesel fuel regulations, sulfur in gasoline regulations, benzene in gasoline regulations, renewable fuel energy regulations, and Canadian ambient air quality standards 2002. Now, when it comes to the reduction of the carbon dioxide emissions from coals, they also have another regulation from 2012. So they adopted this the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions from coal fired generation of electricity regulations, and this regulation set out a very stringent performance standard for the coal fired electricity generation units, and this is where you will find most of the industries will come into play. And all those industries which are coal fired, they are regulated by the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions from coal-fired generation of electricity regulations of 2012. This regulation is a performance standard regulation, as I've already mentioned. So there are certain criteria that they have clearly set out with respect to the carbon dioxide gases and all the emissions which are pretty much there as regards the same. And they have also specified the performance standard timeline, which is pretty much continuing till 2029. And there were certain amendments also which came in the year 2018 with respect to the coal-fired electricity generating units to comply with certain energy performance standards of 420 metric tons of carbon dioxide per gigawatt hour of electricity produced by 2030 at the latest. So they are emphasizing a lot to reach their goal to reduce their emissions, as they have mentioned in their nationally determined contributions to in Paris Agreement. With respect to all these other regulations that I have mentioned, they come under the full quality standards. The gasoline regulation is there, which in fact limits the concentration of lead in the gasoline, which are usually produced, imported, sold, or even offered in sale in Canada. So in order to regulate that, they have this particular gasoline regulations. And in fact, this regulation also emphasizes on record keeping, on reporting obligations of leaded gasolines from time to time. And however, the gasolines which are used for aircrafts are exempted from this regulation, and the leaded gasoline which are used in competition vehicles like those F1, racing. You know that, right? So for all those racing, competitions, the competition vehicles, they are not subject to this particular regulations. Now, in addition to that, you have a sulfur and diesel fuel regulation, which in fact sets a very maximum limit of sulfur and diesel fuel for the use of all those on-road vehicles, and they have specifically ensured a limit in that. They have set up a limit of 50 milligram per kilogram for all those on-road diesel fuel run vehicles. And sulfur in gasoline regulation, they have also limited the standard of sulfur in the gasoline to 14 milligram per kilogram starting from January 2017, and it kind of they have specified a time and they have decided that this particular amount should be reduced. So for sulfur in diesel fuel engines, that they have set out that it's currently, if I'm not wrong, 15 milligrams per kilogram, and they'll reduce it. But when it comes to the sulfur in gasoline engine, then they have decided currently, which is I believe 14 milligram per kilogram. But by 2020, so I think by end of this year, they have to reduce it by 12 milligram per kilogram. This is what the sulfur in gasoline regulations clearly specifies. And finally, then you have this benzene in gasoline regulations. And benzene in gasoline regulation, in fact, this also sets out the limit of benzene that are used in gasoline, and they are pretty much this regulation also prohibit the sale of gasoline which are used in a particular having vehicles which where the concentration of the benzene in the gasoline is more than 1.5%. So this is something which they have clearly set out. They have also set out the limits for benzene emissions number, which are kind of related to gasoline composition to predicted emissions of benzene from gasoline powered vehicles. So this is what they have done. And when it comes to other new and renewable energy, Canada is not left behind. In fact, there is something called renewable fuel regulations, which they have also adopted in 2010. This renewable fuel regulation, this is a federal law, and in fact, it requires all the fuel producers and importers to have an average renewable fuel content of at least 5% based on the volume of gasoline that they are producing or importing into Canada, and of at least 2% based on the volume of diesel fuel and heating distillate oil that can produce or that are produced or imported in Canada. So these are basically to govern the all these limits relating to use of certain gasolines and use of the diesel fuels, the volume of use of diesel fuel. So they're pretty much technical in nature, but pretty much clear also at the same point of time. So the Canadian government, in a way, they want to promote the clean fuel standard. Yeah, they want to promote clean energy, so that's why they have placed this clean fuel standard regulations. And this has been done, of course, under the aegis of Canadian Environment Protection Act of 1999, so that it can help Canada's reduction in their GHG emissions. And this is what they have. In fact, if you refer to this regulation, the Clean Renewable Fuel Regulations of 2010, the objective of this regulation is to achieve 30 megatons of annual reductions in GHG emissions by 2030. So they want to set a target. They have already set a target. They want to achieve the target of 30 megatons of annual reductions in GHG emissions by 2030 by contributing to Canada's effort to achieve its overall GHG mitigation target of 30% emissions reduction below 2005 level by 2030, which they have mentioned in their nationally determined contributions. So these are the laws that is there with respect to the pollution. But finally, there is something called, especially with respect to ozone layer. So here, in order to regulate the ozone standard, the Canada came up with Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards 2002. It's basically the driver for air quality management across Canada. It also refers to the depletion of ozone layer, and this is basically, this comes under this entire Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards. It controls the entire air quality management across Canada, and they are agreed by the Canadian Council of Ministers and the Environment Agency, basically the Environment Ministry for Canada, which is of course an intergovernmental forum also for collective action on environmental issues of not just national but also international concerns. So these are all the ministers from federal government and 10 provincial governments and 3 territorial governments. They all come together at the congregation of all these ministers, just all in one, and they form this Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment. So besides the ministry that we have in our country, like Environment Protection Act, we know the central government is there, and then you have this Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. But we don't have anything like this, where of course we have representations. We have representations in our pollution control boards and several other, like wildlife protection board, etc., etc. But this is something which is very different, where I found the representation from federal government of all the ministers and 10 provincial governments and 3 territorial governments. So in a way, it is there, even we have, but this is exclusively for not just national but also an international concern. So this is the element of difference in here. So this air quality standards, which was established as a non-binding objective as per the Canadian Environment Protection Act, but at the same point of time, it's a collaborative effort. It's a collaborative national air quality management system, because the aim is to ensure a better environment and to protect the human health. So this is what it is, and this in fact has been developed with an idea to reduce all these emissions and to control and check all these other forms of gases like sulfur dioxide, particulate matters, and ozone, to be very specific. Industrial associations, NGOs, indigenous organizations, they also kind of participate in development and review of this particular collaborative national air quality management systems and standards from time to time. So this is what it is with respect to the Canadian law relating to pollutions. I hope you will also refer to these regulations, which are all available online, and just have a look at it. It is very much interesting, and you will find a lot of similarities which is there with respect to American legislations. In fact, I also got a lot of information through the internet only with respect to Canadian laws, and you can also find the same. It's there, and whatever I have mentioned here, you will find a reference of the same in there. So please do refer to that, and if you find any difficulty, you can write to me. I'll help you to get that. So just have a look at it, and just it will give you an idea about the comparative pollution laws. So this is all for Canadian pollution laws. In the next class, I'll deal with some other facet of comparative environmental law. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of your family, stay safe, stay home. Thank you.